My name is Dénes Csala. I'm a lecturer at University of Lancaster, and together with my colleague who has retired meanwhile, Steve Wrigley, we have done a much more engineering type analysis. So what we have heard so far was sort of like very much on the broad picture. What we did is we looked at the canal boat and we checked what if we converted that canal boat to a hydrogen fuel cell boat. So I'll try to tell you the story as briefly as possible. The project was called Hydrogen for Sustainable Waterways, and then kind of like the motivation behind it was that a lot of times when we discuss decarbonization, we tend to include the electricity system, maybe if we are lucky the transportation system, but even the transportation system, when we talk about it as an aggregate transportation system, what we actually mean is road transportation system. So aviation and definitely maritime transport is a lot of time left out. And even if we include maritime transport, we typically mean actual maritime transport over the seas and not inland waterways. So it's one of the let's say most underlooked areas of decarbonization. But we do have a lot of canals inside the UK, and then what would be the options for decarbonizing some of those? This was the premise. While decarbonization can happen on a small scale, like if we have a small, like a patrol boat or even a small tourist boat that you can rent for yourself, I think on Windermere, if you've ever gone for a cruise in the small two-person boats, some of those are electric, and then they are battery electric in a lot of cases. But one of the issues that we found is that especially around the Cumbria in general and sort of Lancashire as well, but especially in the Lake District, the electricity grid isn't really in a shape that would allow a rapid increase in let's say, suddenly a large amount of boats that would require electricities, especially the power throughput that would make sort of the charging times viable. So perhaps one of the other options that you need to look at was hydrogen. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the technology. The way that hydrogen boats would work is you would have to have a way of producing hydrogen. Then you would need to somehow store the hydrogen on the ship, and then you would have a fuel cell that would convert that hydrogen to electricity. And then, of course, there's a little bit of more science to how do we produce the hydrogen. You can produce it from hydrocarbons, where you have like brown hydrogen. You can produce sort of like recaptured hydrocarbons, where you have blue hydrogen, and then you can actually produce it with electrolysis from renewables, where you would have green hydrogen. Of course, this is what we would be looking at. So the story, we partnered with a small company called Kingfisher Cruises, and then they operate canal cruises on the Lancaster Canal. So the Lancaster Canal is a little bit of it's not part of the wider UK canal system, but you can still, from top to bottom, so to speak, sort of like Barton to Grange, it would be like around 1 hour of continuous cruising. And the Kingfisher had a 40-person canal boat. And then what they were doing is usually evening cruises or sometimes like actual water taxi services, but they would have several refueling points, several stopping points along the way, and then it's kind of like midway in the Gullgate Marina they would refuel. So what we looked at is, okay, if you have an electric propulsion, what would be the cost for batteries? And then if we wanted to stay within a comparable cost area, and then we wanted to have a fully fuel cell boat without worrying about the origin of hydrogen at this point, would that technically be feasible? And then we used sort of like a software simulation in order to simulate what would be the conditions on the canal. There are different draft conditions, the power requirement, depending on how wide is the canal, a little bit changes for the boats, depending on your weather, of course, it changes for the boats, whether you have to heat a lot, whether is it a seated dinner, or is it just like a sightseeing cruise? And then what we found was that if you don't make a refueling stop, you would have to have 17, they just call them genie bottles. So that's the typical kind of like a meter tall Linde hydrogen storage bottle. And then you would have to have 17 of those. So first of all, where do you put it? Technically, you could put it on top of the boat, but if you're going on kind of like a historic cruise, that's a bit, it's a bit odd to have 17 hydrogen cylinders on the top. But then on top of that, the major issue was that kind of like the operating costs for the boat, they were on their, in terms of fuel, they were around £500 per month. And then this would have been £5,000 per month. So it would have been a 10x increase just in terms of operating costs. So that didn't make it work. Then we went to, so it was clear in the beginning that if you want to operate a hydrogen canal boat, you would have to necessarily introduce a refueling stop some way midway through. So then how does the hydrogen get to the refueling post? Building the hydrogen infrastructure, of course, it's like a chicken and egg problem, but then maybe if you want to do it commercially, possibly the best way would have been to have kind of like a lorry trailer. So they, we work with a company called NanoSun. They operate these semi-mobile hydrogen refueling posts. So you take the lorry trailer, you take it to an actual hydrogen production facility, you fill it up, and then the canal boat would have operated, if it's only using it, for more than like half a year from that or so, but definitely on the scale of months. So that would have been a semi-permanent solution. So that brought the costs down to around £2,000. So that would be 4 times more expensive than what you have today. And then finally, we looked at, okay, what if you would actually build kind of like a hydrogen refueling station, such as the ones that you have for road vehicles. So unfortunately, in the north, I think the closest to us is next to Sheffield in Rotherham. So that's still quite a, don't think about buying a Toyota Mirai just yet. But if we did have, let's say, one of those either in Lancaster or in the Gullgate Marina, that would bring costs to be comparable in terms of operational costs to where we are today with the diesel operational costs. Of course, the conversion would still, so that's not taken into account, that would still take a significant amount of time, amount of money. But I think we were confident enough to say that in principle, we could possibly have fuel cell canal boats, but it's inevitable that we develop the hydrogen structure together with that. Then we developed this into a proposal to Innovate UK, and I see some of my partners who we submitted the proposal with are here. And then that was also the angle that if you have a large cruise ship, sort of like the ones that you see on Ullswater or Windermere with hundreds of passengers, just the sheer amount of power to charge that cruise ship, even within the timeframes that we see with cars, sort of like a few hours. Basically, the entire electricity grid around the Lake District would have to be redesigned. So the only real option is hydrogen. And I think that's all that I wanted to say about this small project.